Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing another Sharks player review, and this time around we've got Sharks defenseman Henry Thrun. Thrun's history with San Jose is rather short, but pretty interesting, I would say. Acquired in a trade in the 22-23 season near the deadline with the Anaheim Ducks in exchange for a third-round pick, but what makes it interesting is that at the time, Thrun was not under contract. He was a college player drafted by the Anaheim Ducks who was playing his senior year in the NCAA, which would have given him the opportunity, had he waited until the offseason of that year, to become an unrestricted free agent. That would have given him the freedom to sign with whichever NHL team he chose to do so. And there were a lot of interested parties, including San Jose, who in fact were so interested that they were willing to give up a third-round pick to get the few-month head start to discuss with Thrun and trying to convince him to sign in San Jose. Now, the reason it seemed why Thrun didn't want to remain with Anaheim is that they had a lot of really strong defensive prospects in their system, and it seemed as though Thrun wouldn't have much of a clear path to become an NHL defenseman if he had signed with Anaheim. On the other hand, the Sharks were very thin in this particular area. In fact, they remain quite thin on defensive prospects, and so Thrun would immediately become one of their top defensive prospects right out of the gate. So it only took a few days from the trade for Thrun to actually sign with San Jose, and only a couple of days later when he was making his debut against the Vegas Golden Knights. And it was a stellar performance in his debut game. One of the best first games I have seen from a Sharks rookie in a very, very long time. If you removed the names and numbers off the back of these jerseys, I would have thought Thrun was some, not necessarily elite, but very good top 4, if not top 2 defenseman, just based on his play in that particular game. And it was not against some random basement-dwelling team. It was against the Vegas Golden Knights, who would go on to win the Stanley Cup that very season. So not a slouch type of team, and yet Thrun really was that good. Now, the rest of his season wouldn't necessarily live up to that hype, but it would still be good enough that one thought that Thrun would be an easy lock to make the team for the next season. And while his training camp and preseason were less than stellar, he would indeed be on the roster come game 1. But again, those first couple of games were not very good, and in fact were so not good that he would get sent back down to the San Jose Barracuda, where he would remain for a couple of months, only earning a recall in the middle parts of December. And after those first couple of games again, I thought Thrun would get sent right back down, but Greer and Quinn made the decision to keep him around, and while it didn't really work for those first couple of weeks, things were a bit shaky still. Eventually it did work its way out, and Thrun became one of, if not the best defenseman for the San Jose Sharks in the latter parts of December into the early mid parts of January. Unfortunately for Thrun, his season would get slightly derailed by a combination of the fact that he would get injured for a couple of games, but also due to the All-Star/bye week, which saw the Sharks not play a single regular season game for a 2-week period. By the time the Sharks resumed their season in the middle parts of February with Thrun back on the roster, he ended up returning to his extremely inconsistent level of play, where some games he would be very good and the best defenseman for the San Jose Sharks, but other games he would be by far the worst defenseman for San Jose, or at least one of the worst, because there were a couple of bad players, and it was just absolutely terrible to watch. So it seemed as though going into every single game, we'd get a coin flip where you'd either end up with the end of last season type of Henry Thrun, or the type of Henry Thrun who gives away the puck in the defensive zone like it's Halloween candy on the 31st of October. You never really knew which one you were going to get. To get into these statistics, before we actually get into the ones written on the board, there are a couple that actually stood out for me when I was doing my research on Henry Thrun. The first of which is his lack of physicality that he displayed this season. In terms of hits per 60 minutes, he was the lowest by a decent margin amongst all defensemen on the San Jose Sharks. Now, this isn't necessarily the end of the world. Maintaining a large amount of hits isn't the end-all be-all of being a good defenseman in the NHL. In fact, one of the best defenseman that the Sharks have ever had, Marc-Edouard Vlasic, who of course the Sharks, he's still on the team, but during his prime years in the early 2010s, he did not have a lot of hits. He would always maintain right near the bottom of the list for the San Jose Sharks defenseman in terms of hits per 60 minutes because his positioning was so good and his stick was so good that he can defend enough with that, just getting in the way of players and not really having to lay the body on them. On top of that, you're not really going to get a lot of hits if your team is actually possessing the puck while you are on the ice. So again, it is not an absolute necessity to be able to pull up those hits, but you would like to see a certain increase in terms of physicality. The slightly more worrying stat is the fact that in terms of blocked shots per 60 minutes, he also was near the bottom, in fact, at the bottom amongst all Sharks defensemen. Now, technically, someone needs to be near the bottom, but if you are Henry Thrun and you have the aspirations of becoming one of the best defensemen for the San Jose Sharks, this is definitely an area that needs to be improved on. Blocked shots are so important, even for the best of the best defensemen who you're hoping to be possessing the puck, especially if you take a look at into the playoffs. One of the reasons why those games are so low scoring is because players and defensemen in particular are so good at getting into shooting lanes. You need to be able to do that if you really want to stifle other teams' offenses, and Thrun was not doing enough of that this season. So definitely areas to improve on for sure. But as we move into his actual statistics here, 51 games played, 3 goals, 8 assists for 11 points. Like I said, missed a decent chunk of the season due to his time spent with the San Jose Barracuda, and these offensive numbers don't really jump off of the page. While Thrun was advertised as slightly more of a two-way defenseman just due to the fact that how things lined up this season where there just wasn't a lot of offense, his numbers clearly show more of a defensive side. If there is some good news in terms of offense, is that if we actually take a look at Thrun's production on the power play, it actually was pretty good. In fact, he led all defensemen in terms of power play points per 60 minutes. He didn't really get a ton of time in this area. To put it into perspective, he had less than a third of the power play ice time that Kalen Addison had this past season, but when he was playing on that top power play unit, he did manage to contribute. And so if Ryan Warsofsky is a bit more free with putting Thrun in that particular position, we might see his offensive numbers go up as soon as next season. We shall see if that indeed happens. In terms of his plus minus, a minus 22 might look a good bit better than, for instance, Mario Ferraro's minus 38 that I talked about in my previous player review, but it should be noted that this only is this high, so to speak, compared to the rest of the Sharks defensemen because he only played 51 games. The Sharks, they lost a lot. They had terrible goal differential in the majority of their games. Had Thrun actually played a full season, his plus minus would have naturally gone down. In fact, if you actually take the average over a full 82 game season based on these numbers, he would have ended up at a minus 36, which is pretty much in line with what Ferraro had. In terms of his time on ice, 20 minutes on the dot actually puts him second on the team amongst defensemen, a good bit behind Mario Ferraro, but still above the likes of Jan Ruda and Kyle Burrows. And it shows the interesting approach that David Quinn took with young defensemen this past season. When it comes to coaching young forwards, something that we already knew from his time with the New York Rangers, he's a lot more strict with a lot shorter of a leash. William Eklund, who was one of the best forwards for the San Jose Sharks through the majority of this season, would have multiple games in which he would get benched or he would miss multiple shifts because he would make a singular mistake. But when it came to Thrun, even if there was a mistake or a couple of mistakes or multiple mistakes in a particular game, he would still get sent over the boards shift after shift after shift. There was a particular game against the Nashville Predators where he ended up as a -6 by the end of the game and still had over 21 minutes of ice time in that game. If that was a young forward, they wouldn't have even had the opportunity to reach -6 because by the time they would be -3, they'd likely be benched for the rest of the game. But for whatever reason, it seems as though David Quinn is much more willing to allow defensemen to learn from their mistakes and sort of giving them a bit of a trial by fire compared to those young forwards. And so his ice time remained relatively steady even through a lot of the games that he was not playing particularly good at, which is why he ends up second on the team in that area. And so when it comes to his grade, at the end of the day, while there were definitely a lot of games that kind of left you cringing a bit with watching how he performed, I would say the positives did outweigh the negatives. Thrun had stretches of time, like I said, in late December to early January, where he showed a lot of promise, and hopefully that is the Henry Thrun that we will see a lot more of going into next season, and as such, I end up giving him the grade of a C+. Class dismissed.